All right, so let's jump right in. We're going to explore this really unique, almost strange period in history, those few decades right after World War II. And this wasn't just about, rebuilding cities. It was about building something totally new, an era that literally created the idea of the middle-class dream, a dream that still shapes pretty much everything around us today.
I mean, really think about it for a second. Why does almost everyone say they're middle class? Your boss, the person making your coffee? It's this catch-all label. And it feels so normal, doesn't it? So obvious. But here's the thing. It wasn't always like this. That whole identity, well, it was built on purpose. And to figure out why, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's 1945. The world is just broken. It has just survived 30 years of total chaos. We're talking 2 horrific world wars with the Great Depression slammed right in the middle. Cities are just rubble, economies have completely collapsed, and people, entire societies, are just deeply, deeply traumatized. And because of all that chaos, the whole system of capitalism, it looked like it was on its last legs. I mean, it seemed fundamentally broken. So, for millions and millions of people, the idea of communism, of a total revolution, started to look pretty darn good. You have to understand, Western leaders were in a panic. They were facing this huge crisis. They knew they had to do something drastic, something radical. Not just to rebuild, but to save their entire way of life from just disappearing. And out of that crisis, out of that desperation, came a solution. A solution that kicked off an era we now call the Golden Age of Capitalism. This wasn't just a small tweak. It was a period defined by some seriously bold, even revolutionary ideas about what government should do, how the economy should work, and really what society was all about. And you can see this pretty clearly on a historical timeline. From roughly 1945 to about 1980, this new way of thinking, they called it social democracy, really took over in the West. Now, what's super important to get is that this was a very specific chunk of time. It was a historical blip, almost an anomaly, It was sandwiched right between the chaos that came before and the whole era of neoliberalism that would come later.
So what was the engine driving all this change? Well, it was an economic theory called Keynesianism, and this was a huge deal. The old school way of thinking was that government should just keep their hands off the economy. But Keynesianism flipped that completely on its head. It said, no, the state has to get involved. It needs to actively spend money, create jobs, and build a massive social safety net, a welfare state, to take care of people from cradle to grave.
Okay, so how on earth did they pay for all of this? Well, the numbers are just staggering when you look at them today. In places like the US and the UK, the tax rate on the absolutely wealthiest people, it shot up to over 90%. Now, the idea wasn't just to punish the rich. It was seen as a practical way to raise the money needed for these huge public projects. Things like universal health care, education, new roads, and all of that, in turn, dramatically lowered inequality. And the results, they weren't just about money. The success of this whole period was measured in how people were actually living. There's this thing called the Human Development Index, the HDI, which basically looks at life expectancy, education levels, and income altogether. And during this time, it just skyrocketed across the Western world. People weren't just making more money. They were literally living longer, healthier, and better educated lives. But all of these economic changes had another effect, one that went way beyond just dollars and cents. It triggered this really profound ideological shift. And some historians argue it was totally intentional. These policies didn't just change how people lived, they changed how people thought about themselves and where they fit into the world. This is what's known as the middle-class society effect. Think about it. The old conflicts, the really sharp battle lines between workers and factory owners, or the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, all that started to get fuzzy. It began to blur. As more and more people got a stable job, a decent home, and could buy some stuff, a whole new identity took over. All of a sudden, it felt like almost everyone was part of this one huge, single thing, the middle class. The whole structure of society literally changed shape. Before this, you could think of society like a sharp pyramid, right? A tiny, super rich elite at the very peak, and then this massive base of poor workers holding everything up. The goal for a lot of people back then was to knock the whole pyramid over. But after 1945, that pyramid started to look more like a diamond, bulging out in the middle. And the new goal? It wasn't revolution anymore. It was about climbing the ladder inside that big, comfy middle. And this created a totally new relationship between people and the government. With the state now handing out education, healthcare, and retirement pensions,
It started to feel like this benevolent protector. People called it the father state. And this built up a huge amount of loyalty. People were now invested in keeping things stable. I mean, why would you want to start a revolution when the system feels like it's actually looking out for you?
So, how exactly did the state pull this off? How did it actively construct this new middle-class identity? Well, it was done through 5 main social and economic strategies. You can think of them as the 5 pillars holding up this new society.
Okay, so these 5 pillars are the graduate, the homeowner, the protected worker, the patriarchal family, and finally, the consuming family. And each one of these played a really critical part in shaping this whole new way of seeing the world. So, pillar number 1, the graduate. This was all about universal public education. It pushed this incredibly powerful idea of meritocracy, the belief that if you just study hard and get good grades, you can make it no matter where you came from. Then you have pillar number 2, the homeowner. Governments actively pushed policies to get people to buy their own houses. And why? Because it gave citizens a literal, physical, financial stake in keeping society stable. Let's be honest, when you've got a 30-year mortgage, you're probably not going to be the first one to join a revolution.
All right, pillar number 3 was the protected worker. During this era, union membership was at an all-time high, and that gave workers a ton of power they'd never had before. Thanks to strong unions and new laws, you suddenly had things like the 8-hour workday, paid vacations, health benefits, unemployment insurance. All of this gave people a sense of security that was completely new.
Fourth up is the patriarchal family, the traditional nuclear family, with the dad as the main breadwinner and the mom running the household. That was pushed really hard as the ideal, stable bedrock for this new society. These kinds of clearly defined social roles were seen as absolutely essential for keeping things orderly and predictable.
And that brings us to the 5th pillar, the modern consuming family. And you can see this perfectly in the pop culture from back then. Just think about the Flintstones and the Jetsons. One's in the Stone Age, the other is in the super distant future. But what kind of life are they both living? It's a 1960s American suburban life filled with consumer gadgets. This is how mass consumption became the absolute core of the middle-class identity. It made that lifestyle seem natural, timeless, like it's just the way things have always been and always will.
Okay, so this whole golden age sounds, well, pretty golden, right? But there was a catch. There was a dark side to all this prosperity. The dream that was built for some, well, it wasn't sustainable, and it came at a huge cost for many, many others. It's so important that we look at the hidden foundations that were holding this whole thing up. It's funny, John Maynard Keynes, the main architect of all this, he actually made this wild prediction back in 1930. He thought that by our time, technology would be so advanced we'd only need to work about 15 hours a week. So why are we all still stuck working 40 hours or even more? Well, the simple answer is that the engine of consumerism needs us to always want more. The goalposts for what a good life looks like just keep moving further and further away.
But maybe the biggest, most obvious problem in this whole story of prosperity is who it left out. This golden age wasn't global at all. It was almost exclusively a thing for the wealthy Western nations, what we call the global North. The huge, huge majority of the world's population, living in what we now call the global South, they were completely excluded from the party.
And that wealth didn't just appear out of thin air. You can think of it this way. The beautiful, well-kept garden of middle-class life in the West was only possible because it was being watered with cheap resources and fertilized by cheap labor that was being extracted from the so-called jungle of the global South. It was a system built on global inequality, and that inequality is what fueled a dream back home.
And all of this brings us to one final, really critical question for right now. The economic conditions that made that golden age possible, the super high taxes on the rich, the powerful unions, those specific global dynamics, most of that is gone now. But the idea, the dream of being middle class is just as powerful as it ever was. And that leaves us with a tough question to think about. Can the dream even survive when the world that built it doesn't exist anymore?